Hello and welcome to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan Muir and I'm here with my co-host Torwen Eerkens, and this is episode 256 where we're going to be talking about nutrition for Hashimoto's. And Hashimoto's is a bit of a condition where the body's own cells attack and damage the thyroid gland. Hypothyroidism by itself is just a condition where not enough thyroid hormone is being produced, and that can happen for a variety of reasons, but Hashimoto's is one of the most common ones. Basically, the immune system mistakenly views thyroid cells as foreign tissues and produces antibodies to destroy them. And that's what leads to the reduction in the production of thyroid hormones.
So common symptoms can include things like weight gain, dry skin, feeling cold, poor memory, fatigue, having sore muscles and joints, depression, and then also reduced libido. It's typically diagnosed through your GP initially, where they will test for anti-thyroid antibodies, thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH, and thyroxine in the blood.
We're going to be talking about mostly nutrition stuff today, but we are going to start with the medical side to start off with. So the medical side can be a bit complex. Some people will need medications and others do not. For example, this is a bit of an extreme example, but if somebody had glaring gaps in their nutrition that could be causing hypothyroidism, addressing those could help, particularly if they're kind of on the borderline of this as well. At the other end of the spectrum, I've personally seen many people who've spent years troubleshooting different nutritional solutions and stuff like that and have been suffering from symptoms that could have been addressed with medication quite simply. The most common medication is levothyroxine, which is converted into the active thyroid hormone T4. When dosed appropriately, it often manages a lot of symptoms or helps manage a lot of symptoms of hypothyroidism, but there are still cases where people still will be getting other symptoms as well. And dosing often needs to be adjusted over time to try to keep things in a kind of sweet spot type of range.
From a dietary perspective, it is best to take levothyroxine separately from your food. Typically, we recommend at least 30 to 60 minutes away from food as a pretty good strategy. So you could take this medication on an empty stomach in the morning, at least 30 to 60 minutes before breakfast. This is because there are a lot of foods, things like coffee, minerals like calcium and iron, that can potentially affect the absorption of this medication.
Talking diet now, there's a lot of individual things we can go through, but I do want to start with just general overall diet in general. A lot of similar rules in terms of having a good diet still apply, particularly as we go through, we'll see a lot of nutrients being linked with thyroid function, so therefore having a good nutritional intake in general is going to be a good idea. But another thing is going to be a general anti-inflammatory style diet as well, because it's kind of in the name to a degree where it's Hashimoto's thyroiditis, so the itis kind of implies inflammation. You could obviously make a link that doing anything that's generally anti-inflammatory could potentially help with that, but beyond that, a general anti-inflammatory style diet is going to be pretty nutrient rich in general. And whichever kind of mechanism that's going to be having the biggest impact through, we have evidence of this kind of mattering through. There was a 2024 cross-sectional study, which I've put into the show notes, where they used the Dietary Inflammatory Index and found that closer quote-unquote adherence to an anti-inflammatory diet was associated with better thyroid function markers in people with Hashimoto's.
Jumping in then, we're going to be going through some specific nutrients that can be beneficial and also things that are potentially recommended to avoid or limit. So starting with iodine. Now, the thyroid gland requires iodine to make thyroid hormones. It's funny because iron deficiency is actually not super common in developed countries, and it's mainly because we fortify products like salt. So iodine is important, but it's also a nutrient that we don't want to overdo because you can consume too much, which can lead to worsening of hypothyroidism.
Another major one is selenium. So a lot of selenium in the body is found in the thyroid, which is part of why this matters. Having a suboptimal amount could contribute to the condition. And a review on the topic found that selenium supplementation can decrease symptoms and improve overall well-being, with the effects being far more noticeable in those who had a deficiency. I really point to this through the lens of, like, there are times I've heard people talk about the fact that nutrition can't quote unquote solve Hashimoto's or anything like that. And I think it would be silly to dismiss it to the point that you think nutrition has no impact, like selenium, iodine, a few other things, but like selenium plays a bit of a role. At the other end of the spectrum, I've heard people in the alternative kind of nutrition world do similarly dismissive stuff in terms of like acting as if selenium is just the answer to everything and just being like anyone with hypothyroidism just needs to have selenium and will solve it. That's obviously a bit of an extreme as well, but the answer is somewhere in between those two. There are also downsides to over-supplementing as well. So if somebody's supplementing, it's usually around 100 to 200 micrograms per day, Or if they're having it through food sources, 1 to 2 Brazil nuts per day is the sweet spot. You could even technically overdo it if you just had heaps of Brazil nuts on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if you saw this, Torwen, but have you seen stuff on inositol and selenium?
Not a whole lot.
Okay, so the way I came across this was, so I've written an article on Hashimoto's in 2019, 2020, 2021, I don't know. I think it was actually, 6 years ago was when I wrote it. So obviously in prep for this podcast, like part of it was like, what is stuff that I have done previously? Obviously I'm always learning and stuff like that, so I added some stuff in as well. But then it was also like, what's been the biggest breakthroughs over the last 6 years? And what looks to be one of the biggest nutritional breakthroughs is co-supplementing Myo-Inositol alongside selenium. So what people have found in these studies is that TSH level, so thyroid stimulating hormone, drops noticeably more when you supplement both together. It looks really impressive. It just seems to be one of the bigger breakthroughs, just doing both of those things. It's one of those tricky ones to communicate because it's like, it's not fully magic, but it does actually seem to help in a lot of cases.
And it's an easy one a lot of the time, Myo-Inositol, to actually source and dose. So that makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the next one then, something that potentially could interfere with thyroid hormone production is goitrogens. I hope that I pronounced that correctly.
Yep.
Goitrogens. Because they inhibit iodine uptake. This is why they are occasionally recommended to avoid, especially if someone has low iodine as that contributing factor to potentially why hypothyroidism is an issue for them. So foods that are high in goitrogens include things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and bok choy. It's a long list, but generally it's mostly those dark leafy greens. Research here is not super clear, but it seems to be okay including them in moderate amounts rather than doing a black and white eliminate them completely.
Yeah, that's kind of my sense as well, where it's like in most cases I wouldn't even think about it. There are a few rare cases I've come across, actually only one client in my life that like was, I don't like kind of like sending it on goitrogens. Like it's just like they were the only vegetables that they liked. And it's like, it's the first time I had to be like, we actually do need to scale this back a little bit. And in their case, we actually did see some changes in their thyroid markers. It's kind of hard to say because there's so many moving parts. Like was it the goitrogens, was it other things? But only once have I had to scale that back with somebody. Another technically goitrogen is soy, but it's also worth talking about in isolation. So a lot of people recommend cutting out soy. Like if you just like looked up nutrition for Hashimoto's, you'll see people talking about this. But there is a review looking at 14 relevant studies which found minimal impact on thyroid markers. I do think that that's really relevant because there is a lot of times you see people being like, do this will really help. But we have 14 studies looking at it and it's found minimal impact. It's like if there was anything, it can't be that big. There are gaps in that review though. For example, a lot of people in those studies were on appropriately dosed medication, which is a huge factor. So I still think there are some cases where it is likely to be a bit more relevant. And case number one is people with subclinical or borderline hypothyroidism. The potential small impact could potentially matter more. And the second one is people with low iodine intake or exceptionally high soy intake as well. Like similar kind of concept. If people are having heaps and heaps of this, I'd be a bit more cautious about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I read that one as well and I saw definitely the impact. Look, if medication is dosed accurately, again, it's one that we're probably going to say there's no need to be black and white. Be mindful. Moving on then to gluten, which is one that I think is maybe more spoken about in things like social media. But it's funny because most of the time it's actually spoken about anecdotally with a little bit more of a mixed research on whether gluten actually has an impact on reducing those thyroid antibodies. So it is important to note that there is a higher prevalence of celiac disease in those with Hashimoto's. So it makes a lot of sense to test for celiac disease and make sure that testing is done before removing gluten to see if that helps with symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also another thing that I'd say the research has evolved and it's gotten to a point that's an even stronger stance. So like when I wrote that article, 2019, 2020, it was pretty much in this position where it's like, you should probably test for celiac disease or whatever. But I remember even writing in that article being like, well, there's no downside to cutting out gluten if you replace it with other things, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think you'd need to, so on and so forth. But like now in 2026, it's clear that it's like, no, this has been studied pretty well thoroughly and it doesn't seem to improve symptoms unless you have celiac disease or potentially non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is, it's a tricky thing to even define. But like if we looked at statistical identifications of what would be perceived to be non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that does seem to be higher in Hashimoto's as well. So potentially worth factoring in. Now, talking about dairy, so one thing that does stand out to me is that lactose intolerance appears to be way more prevalent in those with Hashimoto's. Surprisingly, there is still less research on this than I would expect, but one study stands out to me where they found that in this particular sample size, from off the top of my head, there was 83 people in the study, and they found 75% of them had lactose intolerance. That is crazily high. And I would almost always start there with somebody with Hashimoto's, just being like, should we see if you have lactose intolerance? And I'd start there over looking to completely avoid dairy, because statistically this thing just appears to be far more common. There is, once again, anecdotal reports of people dropping dairy and feeling better. It's not at the point I'd actively recommend that, particularly with what I would perceive to be this skewing of outcomes due to the lactose intolerance as well. But if you did drop dairy and you adjusted your diet well, you can still have a great diet without dairy if you did want to trial that. But I wouldn't say research is pointing in the direction of that at this stage.
And how much more easy is it to go lactose-free than dairy-free?
It's so much easier. And I don't know if you have this experience with clients, but like, I don't talk about this much in the first consult, but there's so many people in the first consult who are unsure if they've got lactose intolerance or dairy intolerance. And like, it's pretty easy for me to pick, being like, this is lactose intolerance. And they also haven't gone the next step with learning a bit more about lactose intolerance. I don't want to prioritize in the first session, but in my head, I'm instantly like, your life could be so much better. Like, there's so many options.
It's an easy one for us to target. Yeah, for sure.
And I don't know. I don't want to go too deep on it, but it's like there's so many easy alternatives for almost every case.
For sure. Moving on then to vitamin D. So vitamin D, again, we're going to say that it's more common for those with Hashimoto's to have suboptimal levels of vitamin D. This seems to be a common theme through a few of the things that we're talking about today in terms of those with Hashimoto's having suboptimal levels. So we know that vitamin D plays a role in lots of bodily function, and the same goes for the thyroid. So there is a potential link with vitamin D and reducing TPO and thyroglobulin antibodies. So as with any other nutrient, it's important to check levels and then aim to supplement if necessary, potentially even going above that minimum safe range.
I'm going to put a few other ones in that category. So I'm going to put zinc, magnesium, and B12 into these categories as well, where I think it's good to just have a good intake of them in general. And if you get benefits from a thyroid perspective as well, that's a bonus. Like, zinc is required for the production of T3, T4, and TSH, so therefore like avoiding a deficiency kind of makes sense as well. Some research has found that zinc helps with thyroid function. There's not heaps of research to the point that I have a strong take on it, but once again, should have a good intake anyway. It's beneficial for other reasons. B12 deficiency, way more prevalent in Hashimoto's than in the general population. I would say this is actually even more well worth being on top of, but the easy thing you can do is just getting a B12 blood test and see. And if you're getting that test, it's like, well, you might as well test vitamin D. You might as well test a bunch of other nutrients as well. Another one we wrote in our kind of like planning for this was magnesium, but there was, once again, surprisingly like way less research on this than I would expect. There's a bunch of like reasons why mechanistically it could be linked, but there's not much being like, take people with low magnesium intake, increase it, show that this improves markers. But once again, I think it's a good idea to have a general improvement in that as well. And there's many symptoms associated with Hashimoto's that could be improved through a better magnesium intake.
And something that we've spoken about on this podcast before as well is that a lot of people have suboptimal magnesium intake. So even just having a look at dietary intake first and then supplementing if that's necessary. Iron deficiency then, another one that's more common in those with Hashimoto's, partly potentially due to the prevalence of that celiac disease and whether or not it's reduced absorption in the gut. Iron is required to produce those thyroid hormones, so again, a deficiency reduces that production. So get a blood test, test those levels and supplement as needed.
And then the final nutrient before we talk about other aspects is omega-3. So it's another one that mechanistically could help, but there isn't much human research. Reducing inflammation is the main mechanism that kind of checks out here, and there are a few other ones as well. Sits in the same kind of category of where I think having a decent omega-3 intake would be a good idea, even if it's not thyroid specific. But like, once again, if you go back through all of the nutrients, having a good diet in general covers a lot of them. There is some more targeted stuff, like for example, the selenium. Like, I don't know what percentage of people would be having like Brazil nuts regularly and stuff like that. So I would be more targeted with some of them, but good diet in general, and also just a blood test to test some of these nutrients too.
Cool. Moving on to some other nutrition strategies then. So we've mentioned a few things, and even in terms of things like the lactose or potentially non-celiac gluten sensitivity that have a role in the digestive system. Something that we talk maybe less about in terms of thyroid hormones is that they do actually play a role in digestion. So Hashimoto's can be associated with slower motility, which can cause issues like constipation. So making sure that we do constipation management where possible, which might include generally aiming for a pretty high fibre diet or increasing fibre slowly. Considering soluble fibre supplementation with things like psyllium husk, or adding in specific fruits like kiwi fruit, which helps to move things through.
Absolutely. It's kind of like the same concepts we'd normally do for constipation, but it just becomes so much more important because that as a symptom is so much more common as well. The whole idea of certain functions in the body being downregulated in a way due to hypothyroidism extends to a lot of other functions in the body. And this leads to the next topic we want to talk about, which is weight management. So due to these functions being downregulated, particularly if thyroid hormones aren't being managed through medication, that also explains why energy expenditure can be a little bit low. There's two actual things I'd point to. Thing number one, the downregulation means the body is literally spending less calories on these processes. And then thing number two is the living with these symptoms makes it harder to be active, so on and so forth. So that's going to be another factor. So with unmedicated Hashimoto's, in research, the reductions I've seen in resting metabolic rate typically extend to as much as a 15% reduction in resting metabolic rate. I do point to that through the lens of two things. One, there is a reduction, and that's very clear, something that exists. Two, I kind of like to point to how big the reduction is, because I think without pointing to a number like as much as 15%, it's pretty hard to kind of quantify in our heads. Like in many cases, like it could be a black and white thing of being like hypothyroidism makes it incredibly difficult to lose weight, so on and so forth. Whereas like with 15%, it's like, well, that's a hurdle, but it's not impossible. The second part though is ideally we do manage the medication side of things or any other thing in terms of getting the hormones back to a normal point, because what the research has shown from a energy expenditure perspective is once hormones are back to a good level, most people's energy expenditure comes out within a couple of % of what you would expect. And it's actually a little bit under on average. And my speculation as to why it's a little bit under is partly just going back to that kind of symptoms kind of thing, being like if somebody has gone through a medical journey of most types, they on average might have less muscle mass. They might have been doing slightly less exercise, so on and so forth. And that would explain the small difference in RMR. But once you get back to normal hormonal function here, things are pretty close to normal. So in that case, we go from the weight management perspective, it's like we do similar things that we would normally be doing. We'd factor in some cases, there is a bit of a reduction. And then we're also going to be conscious of like symptom management just in general in ways that could make this easier too.
And this is something that I think we probably see and manage in practice fairly often. Off the top of my head, I actually did have a hypothyroidism client who went in for an RMR test, and it actually did come out slightly higher than that, 15% lower than the predicted amount. And obviously with time, as we work through a few things, hopefully that number can change a little bit. But regardless, we work with a calorie deficit and we adjust that number based on the results that we're seeing. The last little one then that I want to add on there is gut health, just because thyroid diseases are also frequently associated with things like dysbiosis, which may encourage further inflammation. So it makes a lot of sense to focus on general gut health as well.
Good addition. I like that. We both were reading the same paper earlier today, and there was a big section on that as well.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, should we wrap up here then?
Sounds good. Well, this has been episode 256 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. As always, if you have enjoyed listening, if you could please leave a rating and review, we would massively appreciate it.